All right, so here we go. This is the beginning of the course, and essentially what my entire course is based on. Okay, and that's the chart, and I'll be mentioning the chart um, all year long. I'll be mentioning, in particular, fundamental principles um, as we go through this course, and really the main reason, if I answer that question, is that aim that's right above me, behind me. Why learn the chart? The main reason is so that you understand where power is in our system of government. So, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to explain the chart. At least I'm going to start out with some basics. So the first thing I do is I explain the chart and what it means. And then the next thing I do is I kind of tell some stories so you kind of understand what's on the chart. So the first step is just giving you an overview of the chart. If you have the chart separate, you can take a look at it. I'm going to do screencasts so I can go back and forth between video and the screen and the chart. So here we go. So taking a look at the chart, which says United States System of Government, you see three columns. One is constitutional principles, one is fundamental principles, and one is governmental purposes. And if you look in those columns, you can see basically it's basically the organization of some things that you already have been exposed to for the most part, where you have constitutional principles like limited government. What does that mean? Limited government is the idea that we have a constitution that has very specific powers that are given to the government. And so it can't just do whatever it wants. It has to follow what's in the Constitution. So that's limited government. Popular sovereignty is that concept of the people having a voice in the system. So when we talk about popular sovereignty, and when you've talked about it before in your lives, in other classes, it's basically the idea of elections, that we hold elections and the people have a voice in who their representatives are. And that ultimately the phrase popular sovereignty, the definition is the people are the ultimate authority. So it even goes beyond just the elections and the voting. It goes to the fact that the government is responsible to the will of the people. Okay, but it's more to the functioning of it within the context of the Constitution. How do you do that in a Constitution? Well, you hold elections. Okay, generally speaking, you make it so that, for example, we have freedom of speech that is protected. We have freedom of press, freedom of assembly. These are the things that allow the people to influence the government. And we put that in the Constitution. Federalism. Federalism is another way of limiting the power of government, that you separate the power among the national and state governments. Next, separation of powers. Separation of powers is the idea that you give the writing of the laws to the legislative branch, that the enforcement of laws goes to the executive branch, and that the interpretation of the laws goes to the judicial branch, and that those three branches now separate powers amongst them. Okay? Now, while they all have their separate powers, the next stage is checks and balances. Checks and balances are where the branches can limit the power of each other. So you're familiar with, for example, the President of the United States being able to veto legislation, right? So that's where the executive branch is stopping the exercise of power by the legislative branch. So that's checks and balances. Now, one thing that was not actually written into the Constitution, obviously, was judicial review. However, you could make the case, and many people do, that judicial review is implied in the Constitution in various places. So judicial review has, of course, through Marbury versus Madison, become the law of the land, and nobody complains that the Supreme Court exercises judicial review anymore. But as far as judicial review goes, it was not, strictly speaking, mandated by the Constitution for national laws. For state laws, it actually is specifically in there. So reviewing state laws and seeing if they violate the Constitution, that is in there in Article 6. But the specific, overturning of laws passed by Congress wasn't in there. Some could say that they didn't expect Congress to pass laws that violated the Constitution. That, say, elections would make it so that people wouldn't do something like that. So that's kind of where we are with all of those. So all of those are constitutional principles. And I think these are the things that you are most familiar with. I think that when you've learned about government previously, this is where the bulk of your attention is paid. When you go through the American Revolution into the creation of the Articles of Confederation, the Constitutional Convention, creating the Constitution, and the early Republic, you are really going through the storyline of the creation of these and use of these constitutional principles. So I find that my students are very familiar with the constitutional principles. The other thing that I find my students are very familiar with are the governmental purposes. So right above me there, the governmental purposes, the far column. The governmental purposes are basically, no matter where or when, at least in modern times, a government exists, every government on Earth basically needs to do this, these four things. So what are they? The first is maintaining order. Maintain social order, it says. So the primary way that the government maintains order is by setting laws, and this is, laws inside a country. This is what the police take care of. This is domestic law. This is basically the government policing its own, maintaining orders, like traffic laws. You guys are, going to get your driver's licenses soon if you haven't already. So that's maintain order inside the country. The next thing is provide national security. That's essentially maintaining order from outside the country, protecting the citizens. So that's what our armies usually do. So that's the second thing. The third thing is providing public services. So think of water, electricity, the transportation system, like public transportation or roads. How about public parks? These are the things that the government does to provide services to the public. And some governments do more and some governments do less. But all governments provide some form of public services. And the last thing that they do is control the economic system. So how much is your money worth? How valuable is it? Does it change in value? Does it become more or less valuable over time? So those sorts of questions. So that's the big thing here with the governmental purposes. The government needs to do all four of those things. Now, once again, I'm not telling you anything that you really don't know, right? You know that there are police, you know that there are armies, you know that, the water that you have comes into your house from the government. You know that the dollars that you have that you buy things with are government-backed dollars, and, they're really fancy, they're hard to forge and stuff like that, so counterfeiting is, hard, hopefully impossible. So those are the governmental purposes, and you kind of know that from life, right? So the reason we then study the chart is because you're also familiar with the middle column, but I'm not sure you ever really learned how it relates to the constitutional principles and the governmental purposes. So in the middle column, we have fundamental principles. This is the most important column, and this is also the column that you basically have never really learned about in school at all, and in some cases haven't really talked about outside of school that much. So what does that mean? So fundamental principles are the values that are shared. And in our case, these principles are the values that are shared by the American people. Okay? Um, and so what are those fundamental principles? And in some ways, by the way, these are values that are shared by everybody everywhere to some extent, but they have, if you'd say, like flavors. They're different in different places. By the way, they're different in different places within the United States of America, too. So, what are they? What are these fundamental values? Well, the first one is natural rights. You're probably familiar with that phrase from John Locke's teaching, and natural rights are to life, liberty, and property. And basically, the idea is that whoever you are in the United States, you think one of the things government should do is protect people's lives, their liberty, and their property. Okay? The next is common good, that the role of government is to protect everybody in a society, not just a select group or a few. The next is justice. Justice is basically the idea of fairness, is the government being fair when it acts? Or is it being unfair or unjust when it acts? A lot of times we think of things as being just or not based on the fourth one, equality. Are people being treated equally under the law, or are they not? Okay? Americans, interestingly, have a different way of thinking of equality. In other places in the world, equality means like equality of lifestyle. Like everybody has a house, everybody has a car, and things like that. In America, Americans tend to think of equality as being people being equal if they have equal opportunity to succeed. And if they don't, that's when you're unequal. So Americans are perfectly fine with one person being a billionaire and one person being homeless, as long as they both had the same opportunity to achieve whatever it is that they wanted to achieve. And so that's something that kind of sets us apart in the world, because most places don't think of equality that way. The fifth category is consent of the governed, that when the government acts, it's doing what the people want the government to do. Sometimes this consent, like in other countries, like say Russia or something like that, there's no consent of the governed. The government gets to act for the benefit of the people, for say the common good, but it doesn't matter if it's something that the people actually want the government to do or not. The government can do it without the consent of the people, because the government, quote unquote, knows best. That's not how America works. Americans think that the government should be doing what the people want it to do. And then the last category is higher law. Higher law is the idea that that there's a law that's above everybody in the United States of America, so that nobody is above the law. Sometimes we refer to this as the quote-unquote rule of law. And so it's the idea that even if the President of the United States does something illegal, they might not be able to be charged with a crime while they're in office, but when they leave office, they can be charged with a crime. While they're in office, they can be impeached from office, and they can be removed and then charged with a crime if the American people think that it's serious enough. But the idea is that everybody is under the law, it's not like the government is separate from the people in some way. Now, why is this important? And that has to do with the bottom line. If you can take a look at the bottom line, it says constitutional principles are the means used to satisfy the ends of respecting fundamental principles and fulfilling governmental purposes. Now, that's quite a sentence. That's quite a handful. And I would not be surprised if you're like, what are you talking about? Here's the takeaway. If you look over at constitutional principles, the only reason that constitutional principles really exist is to make sure that the government does those governmental purposes, which you know, but it has to do it in a way that lives up to the values of the American people as expressed in the fundamental principles. So, an example. Let me give you an example. An example is, what if the President of the United States does something that does provide national security? The example I often give is George W. Bush, after September 11th, issued a secret executive order. In that executive order, he allowed wiretaps of American citizens without a warrant under certain circumstances. Okay. Later, when people found out, about 3 or 4 years later, when people found out about this, they said that that was unconstitutional and it was a violation of people's liberty for the government to be listening in on the phone calls of Americans. Okay, so what did George W. Bush say? Well, George W. Bush said, but it's good for national security. You can't complain because I'm providing national security, right? And some people supported George W. Bush, used a fundamental principle and said protecting national security is for the common good. It's what's best for everybody. And so it's okay to do these warrantless wiretaps. But the power to say that George W. Bush was wrong, the only place you could go was to a fundamental principle. So that's why your power is actually in the principles. If you want to argue against the government, you need to use phrases like, you're taking away my liberty. You're not benefiting everybody for the common good. What you're doing is unjust, unequal. We didn't agree. We didn't give our consent to these types of laws. Or, you're under the law too. There's a higher law that's above everybody, and you are violating that. That's where the power of the everyday person comes in. The question is, why? Why is the power of the American people located in the fundamental principles? And it's because these are the values that fundamentally we share. We can disagree on which one matters more at any one particular time, but we all care about all of them. All right? In general, sometimes Democrats care more about the natural rights and liberties, and in certain circumstances, similar circumstances, Republicans care more about the common good. And so Republicans would be more likely to give up some liberty in order to protect the common good. And Democrats kind of want more liberty and less common good in some cases. And sometimes it's vice versa, right? Sometimes it's less liberty. Let's say, your right to own a gun. A Democrat would say you don't have the liberty to own the gun, and a Republican would say, yes, you do. A Democrat would say it's not for the common good for people to own guns, whereas a Republican say that it is. So sometimes they're vice versa, they flip. So the values that are shared are really in the middle. Another example of why this really matters is this is our power to judge everyone around the world. Okay? So the example I often give, I've been giving for over a decade, for a very long time, is if you remember that after September 11th, we invaded Iraq. Okay? And when we invaded Iraq, we were looking for weapons of mass destruction. Now, you probably know we never found any weapons of mass destruction, and that's another story. However, we captured Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was killed. He was the leader of Iraq. Now, being the leader of Iraq, what had he done? Well, he had actually done things like bombed his own people with chemical weapons. So, like, babies were then born with, like, mutated arms and eyes and faces and stuff like this. He had assassinated members of parliament, like invited parliament to come together and said, hey, how about you five go out back? And they went out back to a firing squad and just assassinated. So he was not a good guy. And there wasn't anybody who thought that Saddam Hussein deserved to stay in power, right? And so when we judged him, guess what? We've been judging him forever. and saying that he wasn't a good leader, that we didn't believe in what he was doing to the Iraqi people. The majority of people in Iraq are actually Shia Muslim people, and he was Sunni, and he gave all the privileges to Sunnis. So he wasn't treating people equally. So we really criticized him using the fundamental principles. But you want to know what he said? He's like, how dare you? We have a constitution, limited government. We have elections. I win 99% of the time, or 99% of the vote. We have federalism. I give regional autonomy to various areas of Iraq. There's separation of powers and checks and balances in our parliamentary system. Most people don't have our presidential system. They have a parliamentary system. And most places don't have judicial review. We're one of the rare places that has judicial review. Okay? So he's like, what am I doing? I'm maintaining order. I'm doing it for national security. I provide public services. I provide water. I provide electricity. When America took over Iraq, we did worse at those things, at providing public services, than Saddam Hussein had done. The Iraqis were like, bring back Saddam Hussein. At least we'll have water, or at least we'll have electricity. Saddam Hussein controlled the economic system. And yet, there weren't any Americans that said it was bad for Saddam Hussein to be taken out of power. Why? Because we all agreed that he wasn't respecting the life and liberty and property of his people, that he wasn't acting for the common good of all Iraqis, that he wasn't behaving in a just or equal manner, that he didn't care about the consent of the governed, and he certainly wasn't limited by a higher law. So that's where our power is. That's where our ability to judge the government comes from those fundamental principles. What's interesting to me is that you now are seniors. I've just explained to you that your power is in the fundamental principles. And you're about to go out into the world. Why is it that for the most part, most likely, you've never heard of this before? Something to think about. So my goal with you is to have you be able to locate these fundamental principles, that when we're doing current events, when we're talking about the world, that you are able to actually verbalize this, that you're able to say, well, no, people's liberty is being violated, or they're not doing it for everybody, it's not for the common good, or that's unjust and this is why. Because when you speak that way, anybody that you're talking to, they can't dismiss you. You can't be dismissed. They can't say, oh, but you're just 17 years old. Because you can say, but liberty is being taken away. And you care about liberty, and they care about liberty. So they can't just dismiss you. Whereas if you have an interpretation about, well, you know what, Donald Trump is violating the separation of powers. Guess what? Donald Trump's got lawyers that will say that he's not. So that column, the constitutional principle column, is for lawyers. And they win there. Okay? And governmental purposes, as long as, the President of the United States is maintaining order, providing, national security, public services, and controlling the economy, they can always say, I'm doing what's necessary. This is what government does. But your power is right there in the middle. Fundamental principles. So that's the introduction to the fundamental principles. I'm going to keep on coming back to the fundamental principles. And at this point, I'm going to tell stories about why this is true. I'm not going to put that on the video right now. I'll kind of do that one in class. So that's it for now. And hope this helps you. And I hope that you can use this and adopt this so that it helps your understanding of your role and where your power is in the United States system of government.